Hi, I'm Michelle Stassen. I'm a registered social worker, and in today's video, we're going to talk about family dynamics, and in particular, how addiction can impact family and also how family dynamics can impact addiction. First, I'm going to look at how families exist as a system and some of the ways that families are structured around rules or values that can be helpful or not so helpful. Then we're going to talk about how addiction can have a really big impact on family dynamics and look at some of the common roles that people take on when addiction is present in ways that can actually perpetuate mental health struggles and addiction. As we're going through this topic, you might notice yourself thinking about the family that you grew up in and some of the dynamics that you experienced as you were being raised. And you might also be thinking about the dynamics in the family you're in now, which may or may not be the same as the family in which you were raised. Both sides are important to look at and can be valuable in your recovery. I encourage you to reflect on some of the ways that the family dynamics you grew up with may have impacted you and potentially had a role in your mental health struggles and addiction. And I also encourage you to notice if you can see any of these dynamics playing out in your life or in the family that you're in now, and how your addiction may have a role in that. Throughout this video, I will use the terms family and parents. Every family is different, so these terms are not meant to specifically reference a nuclear family, but it's referring to the people that you were closest to and spent the most time with growing up, and people who were responsible for caring for you in childhood. In your current life, this could mean the relationships you now have with some of these family members, or new relationships that you might have with partners, children, or chosen family. It's helpful to consider that families are complex systems made up of interconnected and interdependent individuals. Systems are formed when various individual moving parts work together to create one whole. Each part impacts the other, meaning if one part of a system changes in some way, all the other parts of the system are going to be impacted and required to change as well. This is also how families work. Anytime something happens with a family member, it impacts every other member of the family, and the dynamics shift and change. All families are made up of different individuals, and each person is deeply shaped and impacted by every other individual in the family, and also by the dynamics between each different family member. Because of this, we can't actually understand an individual just by looking at them as a singular person. We can't understand our own behavior patterns and our own coping mechanisms unless we look at where we learned them and how we were impacted by the systems we've been a part of. The dynamics within each family system are unique and often formed unconsciously by each family member based on the systems that they grew up in and based on their own unique strengths and struggles. As you learn about family dynamics, it can sometimes become very apparent that the dynamics in the family that you grew up in might not have been the healthiest and that you may not be in the healthiest family dynamics right now. It's easy to start placing blame, perhaps on your parents or caregivers or even on yourself. It's important to remember that the way each person operates in a family system is shaped by the way that they grew up and the family system they were part of, which was also shaped by the way those parents grew up and the system that they were a part of. The dynamics of each system are passed on through generations, and unless somebody has learned about addiction, mental health, and family dynamics enough to realize what's going on and take some action to change it, many people are unaware that these dynamics are happening or that they're unhealthy. People can only do the best that they can with what they're aware of and what's been given to them at any point in time. If you notice through this video that you're having feelings of anger or guilt or shame come up, I encourage you to keep talking about this topic with people you trust, like a therapist, your sponsor, or friends in recovery. So let's dive in. Family systems are characterized by a few different things. There's generally some sort of boundaries, ways that the family is made distinct from people outside the family, and ways that specific relationships inside the family have separation from other relationships. For example, parents often have a distinct boundary between themselves and the children. Families also have patterns of power distribution among different family members, specific patterns and styles of communication, and often distinct and unique roles that work together to keep the system operating the way that it's used to. A lot of these characteristics are understood through a series of unspoken rules or values that exist in each family. Expectations about how things should go, what's right, wrong, acceptable, or unacceptable behavior. Generally, these rules aren't vocalized on a regular basis. They are just something that's learned through seeing how parents, caregivers, or other family members interact. Because these rules are often picked on from a very young age, before a lot of people have been able to see that there's other possibilities of how to function, we tend to take those rules on as if they're absolute truth. This is how you live. Some rules or values can be helpful, like it's important to be honest, or we treat each other with respect, or if something is wrong, talk to somebody about it, or don't express your feelings through violence. A lot of families also have less helpful and more destructive rules, though. Rules that can have a profound impact on people's relationships with themselves and their willingness to allow feelings and speak openly with others. Some examples of these rules could be rules around control. For example, one must always be in control of your behavior or your feelings or your relationships. They could be around perfectionism. For example, it's important to always be right, or you have to do things perfectly, or it's not good enough. Some families have rules around not talking or not communicating openly. There may be some unspoken agreements that people don't talk about their problems with each other, or only talk about their problems with somebody other than the actual person they're upset with. There may be rules around blame. For example, if something goes wrong, always blame yourself, or it's always someone else's fault. Or maybe rules around denying yourself and your self-expression, such as you're not allowed to have feelings or express your feelings, or your feelings aren't important, or perhaps don't ask for anything. What you need or want isn't important. A lot of families also have rules around pretending everything is okay, or making sure that people outside of the family think that everything is okay. You might have heard something like, everything is fine, or look on the bright side, or you've always had to make sure that you're putting on a certain type of presentation whenever you're outside of the house. And some rules might have been around not dealing with conflict. For example, if two people have a conflict, just brush it under the rug and move on. Ultimately, a lot of destructive family rules or values are centered around not communicating honestly or openly, not allowing yourself or others to have feelings or express feelings, and also not necessarily trusting yourself or each other. As you've heard me talk about examples of unhealthy family rules, you might have noticed that some of them seem familiar to you. You might even be noticing that some of them are rules that you learned or have been following from a really young age, and you might actually still be following them today. Rules may be impacting your sense of well-being, your relationships, and potentially feeding into your addiction. Recovery is about the opposite of these kinds of rules, allowing yourself to not be perfect, communicating openly with people you trust, learning to open up about what you need and ask for help, allowing yourself to feel and express feelings, and giving yourself permission to not be okay and to need the help of other people in order to get better. Before we move on, take a moment to reflect on some of these family rules or values. Try asking yourself, what are some of the rules you grew up with? What are rules you are still living by today, and how might these rules be impacting your addiction and recovery? Earlier, I mentioned that because families are systems, when one part of the family changes, all the other parts shift too. This is also true when a family member is struggling with illness, including addiction. When one family member is dealing with addiction, the entire family and the dynamics of that family are impacted. Addiction in itself is very powerful, and when it's introduced into a family, often individual family members and those dynamics will adjust around the addiction in ways that can actually keep that addiction going or even make it worse. One example of this: if somebody who is experiencing mental illness or addiction struggles maybe has a very big temper, perhaps when they've been drinking, for example, they may be very quick to blow up if something doesn't go their way. Other family members may learn that the safest way to function without having to deal with the stress of setting off that sick family member is to tiptoe around and sort of walk on eggshells to avoid doing or saying something that might upset the family member with the short fuse. although that may seem like it's avoiding conflict and keeping things from getting out of hand, it also means that people in the family aren't talking about what's going on, and the unhealthy behavior of the sick family member isn't getting called out or addressed. In some research looking at the dynamics of individuals and families where one or more family members are struggling with addiction, we've seen that different family members will often take on common roles within the family. People may develop patterns of behavior, usually unconsciously, that help them to survive and keep the family functioning while there's serious conflict and struggles present. Many of those roles tend to operate on those destructive family rules or values that we talked about earlier, especially things like don't talk about conflicts or feelings. These roles, although they keep the family system functioning and seem to keep everything going okay, they also serve to perpetuate addiction and struggles in the family because nothing gets addressed and nothing has the opportunity to change. I'm going to share a quick overview of some of the common roles that people may take on in families where addiction is present. It's important to note that not every family would have all of these roles. One family can have the same role more than once. For example, a family may have multiple people experiencing mental illness or addiction. And a person can take on more than one role at different times. As we go through some of these common roles, I encourage you to reflect on whether you have ever took on any of these roles when you were growing up, and whether other people in your life might be taking on any of these roles right now. The first role to talk about is that of the person experiencing addiction or mental illness. Often this person may be demonstrating some specific characteristics. This might be impulsive behavior, desperately seeking sensations, a decreased commitment to taking care of oneself, or a decreased interest in being there for other members of the family. This person might be engaging in a lot of social alienation and disconnecting themselves from other family members. They may also be demonstrating a negative self-image, and one way they might be coping with that is by displaying a lot of outwardly focused anger, which can at times be misdirected towards family members. Underneath the surface, a person struggling with addiction is usually feeling a lot of shame, guilt, and fear. These vulnerable emotions tend to not be talked about or shared with the family, who are likely struggling to understand what is going on and why this family member is behaving as they are. At the same time, other family members tend to tiptoe around this person because they're afraid about triggering them into more destructive behavior. If you are struggling with addiction, you probably can relate to this role in some way, and may be taking on this role in your own family. Before we look at some of the other common family roles, take a moment to reflect on how this role looks for you. Do you think your addiction has had an impact on your family dynamics? The next role is what we might call the chief enabler or caretaker. This is a family member who always tries to make everything okay. They can be a bit over-responsible and maybe lacking some boundaries. They tend to sacrifice themselves and taking care of themselves in order to solve other people's problems, especially the problems of the person experiencing addiction or illness. The chief enabler is often doing exactly what their name implies. They're enabling all of the other family roles to take place. The chief enabler is usually trying to keep everyone happy, and one of the ways they do that is by avoiding the issues that are at hand. They may make a lot of excuses for problem behaviors, especially the behaviors demonstrated by the person experiencing addiction. Much like the sick family member, the chief enabler also doesn't want to ask for outside help, so they usually try to fix things on their own, and they often feel a strong sense of responsibility to make sure everyone and everything is okay. That means there may be a bit of pressure to present a good face in public. You can imagine how this would be a very exhausting role, and often results in that family member not getting their own needs met, which can lead them to struggling with resentment, depression, exhaustion, and other mental health struggles. Furthermore, the chief enabler is also keeping the person who's experiencing addiction from facing some of the consequences of their own behavior, which may be helping to keep that addiction going. The next role is called the family hero. This is a person in the family who takes on the responsibility of bringing positive attention to themselves and the family in order to cover up the negative attention that could be caused by the addiction. This is a person who tends to be quite admired and idealized and often is the recipient of a lot of positive attention and achievements, both in the family and also outside of the family unit. For example, somebody who does really well in school, sports, work, or in the community. Often the family hero tends to be pretty perfectionistic. They strive for very high standards. The hero makes the family look good by being very accomplished, and also distracts from negative attention placed on the family member experiencing addiction. It's also a lot of pressure. So underneath that hero's exterior is often a person who has an intense fear of failing, a strong need to stay in control, and a sense of worthlessness, because the only way that this person can feel successful is if they're doing everything perfectly and making sure that the family is getting lots of good attention. The exact opposite of the family hero is another common family role called the scapegoat. This is another role where the function is to take the attention away from the family member who's experiencing addiction. But rather than bringing positive attention, the scapegoat takes on the negative attention to divert it away from the sick family member. The scapegoat tends to take on a bit of an identity of being the bad one or the black sheep of the family. They may seem angry, impulsive, and like they don't fit in with the rest of the family. The scapegoat often will act out in front of others and engage in destructive behaviors, and they'll often get blamed for wrongdoings by other family members. The scapegoat is often dealing with a lot of hurt, rejection, shame, and disconnection. It's important to recognize that people usually don't consciously or intentionally take on these roles. The scapegoat didn't consciously decide to help out the family by taking on the negative attention. These roles are often adopted over time as each member unconsciously learns what's needed from them in order to keep the family system functioning. And these roles can also be shaped by other family members. For example, the family may give a lot of praise to the family hero and a lot of criticism to the scapegoat, which further reinforces those roles. Another family role that can come up is called the mascot. This is a person who might be labeled the family clown. They're often very funny, willing to do anything for a laugh, and quick to act cute or a little bit silly or immature. The mascot could also be called the jester. They provide comedic relief in order to cover up the family's pain and keep everybody happy and acting like things are okay. This is a person that has learned that when confronted with stress, laughter reduces tension. And it is an effective coping tool. It brings a lot of humor to the family, but the problem is that humor is often diverting away from the real problems that are going on and can stop people from actually dealing with some of the issues which may be uncomfortable and painful to deal with. Finally, there's the role of the lost child. This is the family member who's learned that since there's so many big problems going on in the family, the best way to deal with it is to not make any problems at all. They've learned that rather than take up a lot of positive attention or diverting away from the sick family member by taking on negative attention, they're just going to take on no attention at all. They may be ignored quite frequently or take on a very quiet personality and sometimes become almost invisible. The family member will never bring up any problems that they see in the family, and they also definitely don't bring up any problems to do with themselves. They don't ask for their own needs or wants to get met. The lost child often views themselves or their problems as less important, which can lead to low self-esteem and a fear of asking for help. This family member is excellent at avoiding conflict, but in that sense tends to be a bit of a metaphor for what's going on in the family in the first place, which is that problems aren't being talked about. As we've gone through these different roles, you may have noticed a little bit of a theme. All these roles are trying to keep the family functioning, but without actually addressing the fact that there's problems going on and that something needs to change. In order for change to happen, it first takes people being aware of the dynamics going on and being aware that those dynamics aren't really working. Before we move forward, take a moment to think about yourself and your family, either the family you grew up in or the family that you're in now, and ask yourself what might be the roles that you are taking on. The person experiencing addiction and mental illness, the chief enabler, the family hero, the scapegoat, the mascot, or the lost child? Write down some of the behaviors that you think you might be engaging in that fit into one or more of those roles. Families are powerful systems, and family dynamics can run deep. So if you're feeling a little bit overwhelmed by all of this information, that is okay. It's going to take a lot more than one video for you to magically transform the dynamics in your family to be healthier, and you certainly can't go back and change unhealthy dynamics that you might have grown up with. What you can do with this information, though, is start to pay more attention to how you're showing up in your day-to-day life. How are you still living by some of these unhelpful rules or values that you learned growing up? How might you still be playing out some of the unhelpful roles you took on as a kid? You might also want to check in on whether you have taken on some new roles in your family since struggling with addiction. The first step to changing behavior is having awareness that there is behavior you want to change. The next thing is to start to get really clear on when and why it's happening, and then starting to practice acting in new ways. This means stepping outside of roles that you've been taking on and developing new rules and values to live by that are focused on openness, honesty, vulnerability, trust, and a willingness to have hard conversations and feel uncomfortable feelings. You may not be able to change everything all at once, but you can start to think of one or two things that you can do right now to practice a different way of being within your family dynamics. It's also important to recognize that if you've been struggling with addiction, chances are people close to you in your life have been struggling with your addiction too. That means as you engage in recovery, there's recovery that's likely needed for your whole family, whether that be your parents, partners, kids, siblings, or even chosen family. People in your family may not be totally ready to have some of the conversations that you're starting to want to have with them, and they may not be ready to engage in the kind of change that you're ready for. This is where it can be helpful to remember that if all members of the family are impacted by something negative, like addiction, all members of the family are also going to be impacted by something positive, like recovery. Sometimes the best thing that you can do to start shifting the relationships and dynamics in your family is to start changing your own role and your own contributions to those dynamics. It takes time, effort, and a lot of consistency to rebuild trust after it's been broken by addiction. So it's okay to focus on starting small and taking the changes one day at a time. When you finish this video, there's a couple things that you could do to get started on that process. One thing is to go back up to that list you wrote about some of the rules or values that you grew up with and might still be living today. See if you can identify some new rules to change the ones that you've been living by, and write them on a separate piece of paper. For example, if one of the rules was, never tell anyone about your feelings, a new rule might be, it's important to talk about your feelings with someone that you trust. Once you have a list of new, healthier rules that you would like to live by, keep that list somewhere where you can look at it regularly, like sticking it to the bathroom mirror or in your wallet, so you can check in and ask yourself, have I been living by these healthy rules today? And make adjustments if you need to. You can also do a similar activity when it comes to looking at family roles. Think about what kind of role you would like to have in your family. And you can use your creativity here. Perhaps you'd like to be a nurturer or a cheerleader, a protector, a truth teller, a lover, a teacher. It's totally up to you. Brainstorm a list of behaviors you could practice and actions that you can take that would line up more with the role that you would like to have, rather than the less healthy roles you might be taking on. See if you can pick one thing on that list that you could start practicing right now, today. I hope this video has given you an opportunity to reflect a little bit on how family dynamics and addiction impact each other, and helped you identify some ways that you can take action in your life to create healthier dynamics in your own family. Bye for now.